So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to an introduction to outcome mapping. This is a second in our professional development training and awareness raising series. And this week, we're also observing the inaugural evaluation week. So we're very pleased to welcome you all and extremely pleased to introduce our presenter, Kaia Ambrose, who is a seasoned outcome mapping practitioner with over 15 years experience in the field. She has delivered outcome mapping trainings, facilitated teams to apply outcome mapping to their projects and programs, and designed monitoring tools and evaluation processes using OM, as well as writing and presenting on OM in various international fora. She has spent over a decade using outcome mapping to complement results-based management and logic model for monitoring processes. She has worked with a wide range of actors to use outcome mapping, from Google.org to the World Bank Institute, CARE International, and she's currently evaluation officer at the Caribbean Development Bank in the Office of Independent Evaluation. So just join me in welcoming Kaia, and she will go right into the presentation. Thank you, Kaia.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you for having me, giving me this opportunity. I'm gonna, I'll start with just a very brief overview of what this presentation will cover. Because of our short time frame, this is gonna be very much an introduction to outcome mapping, something to whet your appetite. So we'll look at the principles, the core of outcome mapping, and I'll give you an outline of the tools that are involved in this approach as well. But we won't speak to them in detail at this time, and we won't have time to really go into cases. That could be for another webinar, or a workshop setting is usually a 2 or 3 day workshop is really a setting where we really dive into the intricacies and the different examples of how outcome mapping is used. And I just want to point out as well, as you can see here on the slide, that I'm also a steward of the outcome mapping learning community. So if you want to explore more experiences around outcome mapping, or if you have any questions after this presentation about outcome mapping, do feel free to explore that resource, and you can also join up, and that will make you part of a listserv, so you can ask your questions to the outcome mapping community, and members are usually quite good about responding and giving ideas or pointing to additional resources. And sorry, the address for that is www.outcomemapping.ca. So what is outcome mapping? So it's an approach that was developed by the International Development Research Center, which is a quasi-governmental organization, Canadian organization, developed in the mid-90s, and they published a manual in 2001, and that manual is available for free download at the outcomemapping.ca website. And that gives you the basics of what outcome mapping is. And they supported the development, the creation of the outcome mapping learning community in 2006. Then what we've really seen from the initial development by IDRC in the mid-90s is hundreds and hundreds of cases of outcome mapping being used around the world and being adapted and innovated on across all countries, in different organizations, different types of organizations, and different kinds of programming and projects as well, different thematics. So outcome mapping is a participatory approach for you can use it for a planning stage. You can use it for to develop and implement a monitoring regime, a monitoring process and a system for your project or your program. And you can use it to develop a plan for an evaluation as well. And its uniqueness is that it focuses on changes in behavior. And it focuses on those behavioral changes of those actors with whom the intervention works with. And in doing so, in doing this participatory approach with this behavioral change, it's really an approach that's oriented towards social learning and organizational learning, and connected with that adaptive management as well. So what are we learning? And what do we need to change in order to respond better, to get better? And so that learning piece was really a drive for IDRC when they developed the approach and the methodology. How can we create a balance between the traditional, what we see in project reporting is this focus on accountability and to prove that our intervention did the thing that made this change, but how can we balance that with learning in order to improve what we're doing and recognize that our presence as an organization or as a project or a program isn't the only thing contributing to change? So how can we create a little bit more of this balance? And that was one of the key driving forces for IDRC to create it. But along with that initial kind of key driving force, there were some core principles that after looking at the way evaluation was done at IDRC, they thought, okay, we need to kind of shift our philosophy of how outcome mapping is done, and we need to start doing things a little bit differently. So I'll go through some of these core principles, and this is just what the manual, you'll see here the image of the manual, that's what it looks like. So it's when you go visit outcomemapping.ca, look for that image and you can download that. So this cartoon gives a representation of why IDRC, one of the core principles and why I decided to develop a different kind of monitoring and evaluation. What they were seeing is that in evaluative exercises, an evaluation team would normally be external and they would only show up in certain moments. So they would only get one snapshot of the situation, what was going on, versus incorporating a more fluid and ongoing evaluative reflective practice into projects and programs to be able to continuously get a series of snapshots to be able to get the full picture of change and how change happens. And this links a little bit to this next graphic. Then a miracle occurs. And what IDRC was, I'm sure some of you have seen this graphic before. It's been circulated quite a bit globally, and especially when we're talking about theories of change or monitoring and evaluation. This is what really outcome mapping tries to get at, is trying to be more explicit about how change happens, how those miracles occur, who is doing what, and how are those individuals changing in order for the broad change that we're looking at to occur, to be sustainable. What are those actions and activities and interactions that actors need to, or stakeholders need to take and engage in and sustain in order for broader change to occur? And outcome mapping helps us think through that and depict it and capture it and analyze it and reflect on it. So outcome mapping really gets at that that middle stage, the be more explicit step. And IDRC wanted to emphasize this because what they were seeing in their projects was, and I'm sure people are familiar with this, that they were only focusing on outputs or they were only focusing on downstream impact. And sometimes the third component was they were assuming a causal link between the two, between outputs, which are very low level types of results, number of people trained, or number of trainings held, or number of seeds delivered, and assuming that that was the cause of a particular impact 3, 4, 5 years down the road. And losing out, going back to that balance of accountability and learning, really losing out on understanding who really contributed to the change and how they contributed to it, or what aspect of the training helped them to contribute to the change, or how they used and dealt with the seeds to help contribute to broader change in a sustainable way. So that's what outcome mapping really tries to unpack and flesh out. So another one of the core principles of outcome mapping is that it really abides by the field of complexity science. And complexity science can help us embrace and understand and work with messy realities we encounter, especially in development programming. And if you want to know a little bit more, or read about a little bit more on complexity science, then I would suggest taking a look at Bob Williams' publications. But OM really helps recognize the complex messes that we encounter and tries to make sense of them in an accessible way, and really tries to do something about them. So it doesn't just recognize that there's a complex messiness to the context we're working in, but really tries to hone in and see, okay, where is it that we can make a difference as an intervention, or intend to make a difference, and how can we capture that? How can we monitor and evaluate it? So it helps us recognize, in doing so, it helps us recognize that there's a few things that we need to consider when we're talking about social change and that complexity, that the philosophy of outcome mapping helps us be a little bit humble in our development interventions, by recognizing that really change is beyond the control of the intervention. What we do and the activities that we do and the funding that we put into an intervention is ultimately in the control of the actors or the stakeholders that we work with. And it's also, change is also very independent of the project duration. You know, we say a project is 3 years or 5 years, and then that's it. But change happens beyond that, and evolution, things keep evolving beyond that as well. Social change can be very nonlinear as well. And it can be cumulative, so it can have big tipping points where the pathway might shift considerably, and we have to kind of reevaluate where we are and retack or retrack. It can be dynamic and multi-directional, and it can be emergent as well. We can't possibly know all of the situations that we're going to encounter at the beginning of an intervention, but things come up, things happen that we couldn't have possibly foreseen when we started the project, and how do we respond to them? How do we know that they're happening, and then how to respond to them? So outcome mapping helps us recognize that social change has these characteristics, and through the way that it monitors or encourages us to monitor, it helps us try to deal with these as well. So as we know, there are challenges because of this complexity when it does come to that monitoring and evaluation or evaluative exercise. And there's challenges with establishing, we really have to recognize there's challenges with establishing attribution. There are challenges with emergence as well, and making sure that we're learning, but being able to adapt and have the flexibility to adapt creatively as well. So there is some challenges that make outcome mapping, recognizing these challenges, makes it perhaps not a methodology for everyone, or there are certain organizational practices and cultural change within an organization. If they want to take on outcome mapping, there's some changes that need to happen on how an organization views development, or how it views its interventions. If it recognizes well these points and these challenges, and is willing to rise to these challenges, then it'll have a better chance of applying outcome mapping well. And just I like this visual to depict what we're talking about when we're talking about emergence and nonlinearity and multi-directionality. Many times that we get funded to do, we've got, most of the times a very linear, even visually linear results framework or logic model or theory of change, using whatever you want to call it. we have an idea of what we'd like to get to, and we have an idea of what we think will get us there as well. This set of inputs and activities, we have a sense of what outputs and what outcomes that will achieve. We've made some sense of this logical chain. And it is in these situations where we think that, we may know how we're going to get to a certain impact or long-term outcome, that methodologies like outcome mapping may be appropriate if we recognize that it's not always linear. So we may plan it to be linear, but then we know that what we're actually dealing with is this situation where certain activities don't necessarily lead to the output we thought it would, or it's going to take longer or shorter for a variety of reasons. And there's also going to be unexpected changes, unexpected outcomes, both positive and negative. So how do we capture all of this? And this is what outcome mapping helps us to do, both in terms of in a very technical way with certain tools, but also as a reminder, as a philosophy or underlying theory, that we have to remember that this is how the context within we're working really function. So again, to summarize this, we know and we've seen that outcome mapping can be helpful when stakeholders are diverse, actors in a particular context are diverse with different perspectives and roles and relationships. And we know that their interrelationships can influence others and influence their context, and they can be influenced by them as well. And we also know that complexity arises when influencing but contributing to sustainable improvements in well-being, whether it's human or ecological, involves working with stakeholders and influencing them and being influenced by them and their contexts and their interrelationships as well. So just to sum up this section before we go to the next section, this is a critical piece to what outcome mapping embodies. We're not just looking at the destination, we're not just looking at that final long-term impact, but we're being attentive along the journey. Oops, sorry, there's a little typo there. Along the journey, and that's as important as and critical to as well arriving at the destination. It's going to help us understand how we're getting to where we want to be, or if that where we want to be is shifting and changing as well. And in understanding that and capturing data that will help us understand that, we can make better choices of how to move forward as well. So these are the basic principles of outcome mapping. It's flexible. You use it as you need to. Some people use it to design their interventions. Some people use it just to monitor or to evaluate, even if their intervention hasn't been designed using outcome mapping. Some people just use one step of it and not the rest, and I'll go through those steps in just a moment. So it can be very modular in that sense. You don't have to use the entire package, but you can pick and choose what makes sense to you the most in a particular moment. It's meant to be participatory as well. It lends itself well to participation, the types of tools and exercises that are suggested by outcome mapping. But of course, anything is as participatory as you make it, but just to say that it lends itself well to that dynamic. It emphasizes evaluative thinking as well, and this can be something that's a big kind of organizational change, to incorporate evaluative thinking in your day-to-day business, and prioritizing monitoring and evaluation in that way, and being reflexive and being adaptive as well. As we mentioned before, it's focused on organizational learning and social learning as well, and that links with the participation. So it lends itself well to bringing people together, to reflect together, to learn together, and to make concerted action to move forward in the future as well. It's a great tool for self-assessment as well. It can be easily used for a self-evaluation. And it works, it doesn't have to work like this, but it works very well when there's regular face-to-face meetings within a project or a program, and it can incorporate itself easily into those types of meetings. But as I said, like if you download the manual, there is one global project that used it, and they did it entirely by email, for example. So it doesn't always have to be face-to-face. And what you'll see in the manual is this very kind of old school graphic. It's not visually, it's not the best, graphic design wise, it's not the best, but this lays out the main components of outcome mapping. So 3 stages and 12 steps. And the real heart or the real meat of outcome mapping is in this first stage, this big box that's called intentional design with 7 steps. And those 7 steps really get at the heart of the behavioral change of key actors that outcome mapping focuses on as well. And it's a little bit, I said it's a flexible methodology, but then when you see step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc., that you kind of wonder like, okay, well, do I have to use all those? And do I have to use them in that order? And you don't. So it's a bit, it doesn't give the right message to this graphic. You don't have to use all of the steps in order. But if you were to, that's kind of the key order of what you would do. But you can easily go into a project, even if it hasn't been if it hasn't been planned with outcome mapping, you can easily go in and use step 5, progress markers, and do some monitoring using progress markers, for example. But it's important when you delve into the methodology to really understand those 7 steps, because the philosophy, the concepts behind them are what drive the practice, whether it's planning, whether it's monitoring, or whether it's evaluation. All of the guts and all of the details of those 7 steps are what are going to drive your outcome mapping based M&E practice. So those are the 7 most important ones. And then the outcome and performance monitoring, those are just one suggestion of actual formats that you can use to collect information. But my suggestion is, again, these were designed in, late 90s. And since then, people have taken those journals and really innovated them. And those different examples are available on the outcome mapping learning community. So that's kind of the background and the basics, the core principles, the key messages of outcome mapping. And now we'll move on to what can we monitor and evaluate with outcome mapping. If that was your goal, you'd have to complement it with another practice, with another approach or tool. So it really focuses on outcomes, and it focuses on that in 3 different kind of elements or ways or spheres. So it focuses on partners, stakeholder actors, their success and their progress towards the achievement of outcomes. It focuses as well, if you want it to, on the internal performance of the program, and as well as the program's function as an organizational unit through the organizational practices. So not only does it say, okay, let's see what key stakeholders are doing, and what the change is that's happening to them that's contributing to outcomes, but also, do we have the right strategies in place? Do we have the right activities in place? And are we healthy as an organizational unit, as a project or as a program? Do we need to have different practices that will help us support better the partners and the stakeholders? So that's kind of like the package of where we focus kind of data collection and analysis with outcome mapping. And it kind of organizes this in what we call the spheres of interest, influence, and control. And that kind of helps us really think about where it is as a project or a program, we have some control and where we don't have control. And where we have direct influence and where we have indirect influence as well. So outcome mapping makes a distinction between the different types of stakeholders that we work with and breaks them down into what outcome mapping calls boundary partners. There's some new jargon, some new terminology in outcome mapping, and that's something we go over in a workshop, and the meaning behind that terminology. So break stakeholders down into boundary partners and then broader kind of beneficiaries, which would be in the sphere of interest. And the sphere of interest would be at a broader kind of impact level. And our outcomes would sit in this blue circle here as a sphere of influence. That's what we can, as a program or a project, we can try and influence the changes in our boundary partners that are happening here. And our strategies and our organizational practices and what we're doing as a project or a program comes in here in our sphere of direct control. And the corresponding journals that the manual offers, so they correspond to each one of these spheres. For outcomes, we have the outcome journal for intervention strategies and organizational practices. We have the strategy journal and the performance journal. So outcome mapping is really focused on these two spheres here. However, if you have a project or a program that has used outcome mapping as a monitoring tool, for example, or even to frame an evaluation, and you are doing a broader evaluation, you're doing an impact evaluation of this yellow sphere here, the sphere of interest, then you do have the opportunity to use your data and understand. That data can be used to understand why changes have happened in this sphere as well. So it's all part of contributing to the potential of contributing to broader evaluations as well. So I just wanted to emphasize, sorry, I'm just going to do a time check here. How are we doing, Valerie, for time?
Sorry, you're doing well.
Okay, I've got about 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I want to leave a bit of time for questions too.
Sure.
Yeah. So these are the kind of key pieces that we want to, that outcome mapping, especially for monitoring, but not only monitoring, but for setting up our evaluation as well. The emphasis on systemic collection of data on outcomes, even in a monitoring system. So what I've seen normally is that monitoring systems focus on outputs. Outcome mapping challenges us to do monitoring of outcomes as well, because that is where the adaptive management, opportunities for adaptive management and regular learning and improvement come in as well. And that's where, through adaptive management, a program can begin to challenge itself too. How can we get better? I just wanted to give you a quick example of, this is what you'll find in the manual, the outcome mapping manual, the outcome journal, the primary tool. And this is just one example of how it's been adapted for a multi-country climate resilience program. So this was a multi-year, multi-country program, and their data collection was ongoing. But then every 6 months they had a cross-country kind of team meeting to discuss the data, and it was all done online. The data collection was all done online, and it was. So this is just an example of how the form was slightly adapted from this setup, and it was used Google Forms. But in a workshop or a further webinar as well, I can get into kind of the nitty gritty of how that happened. Sorry, I'm just going to skip to this one. Just to maybe finalize with making learning explicit, that, you know, if we go back to that slide near the beginning of the creating the balance, the person on the tightrope between accountability and learning. Learning's not just going to happen on its own. It has to be organized and planned for and created, and it has to have its own calendar, and it's got to be the right time at the right place with the right people. But outcome mapping also kind of pushes us to really look at utilization, focused monitoring, and evaluation, right? So that learning and use itself doesn't start from the data. The data is not the starting point. What the data needs to be used for is the starting point. And in our application of outcome mapping, we've seen that what can help is defining spaces, understanding what those spaces are that are crucial for debate or sharing or reflection and decision making, whatever you need to use the data for, and making the monitoring and evaluation integral to the thinking and doing of an organization and program. So that that's part of the evaluative thinking, creating a culture of evaluative thinking as well. And these are some of the elements that, you know, that we can focus on in terms of creating a use-focused monitoring evaluation system, of being clear on the purpose, the uses, the users, defining those spaces of an organization where you can get the data use, and then defining what are your information needs so that they feed into those spaces and get to the right people at the right time. And I'm just gonna skip ahead. I always like this graphic to kind of illustrate that point. Like I'm sure very familiar for you as well, you know, the problematic of evaluations sitting on shelves and no one ever reading them or looking at them. So trying to get users to understand what it is exactly they want the data for, and then planning for that. So I'm going to leave it here so we have some time for questions. And oh, Valerie, I do see that you brought up the website for the outcome mapping learning community. Yep, and there's a listserv, and there's tons of resources. Yeah, different, like larger versions of this PowerPoint presentation that I just did, for example, that kind of takes you through all the steps. Shorter articles, many things. So we have a few minutes for questions. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And any broader questions you have as well. It's always fun to post them on the outcome mapping learning community and see what kind of answers you get. But if you do have any questions, Valerie, I can't tell how many people are on right now, so I don't know if we want to take them verbally or if people just want to put them in the chat.
We have 19 people on.
Okay.
So if anyone wants to ask a question, they can either raise their hand if they know how to do that, or type the message in, or just unmute, and we will go that way. I'll just start by asking one. Kaia, in one of the slides you'd mentioned, you know, the importance of face-to-face meetings in I think doing the monitoring according to outcome mapping processes. So in an organization such as ours, where we are virtual, why is face-to-face so much more important than?
Well, I think it can. Yeah, sorry, I should have said like speaking to speaking. So even if it's virtual, even if you can get on a webinar,
right,
or connect virtually, that's an important piece.
That works. Yeah. In other words, not exchanging a whole lot of emails and
not relying only on that, but making sure that you've got a space where you can make sense of data together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And in the quick example I showed of the online form that people filled out as the outcome mapping journal, um, in that case, each of the countries would get together in their country, and then they would kind of feed up the information. There'd be M&E leads for each of those countries, and we would get together with them. So they would have their meeting in country, but then we'd also have a virtual meeting with all the M&E practitioners to kind of aggregate all of the data from all of the countries.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Anything else
Anybody
from
else?
anyone?
If I could just jump back. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. Caroline Beckford
Hi,
here.
Caroline.
Hi. I am not sure. I joined a little late. Apologies. If you could explain or say, I'm used to results-based management. I know of outcome mapping, or I've seen it. I've not used the technique. But in terms of what's the difference? Basically, I just want to see if there's any fundamental differences in the approach.
I think if you so the results-based management I'm familiar with is the Global Affairs Canada version of results-based management. And if you read their, like, I don't know, 200-page new 200-page guidance document on it, you know, I think they're really good about talking about complexity and paying attention. But I think the critique that outcome mapping has of results-based management is that it can become too oversimplified when you're putting it into those, what is it, 16 boxes or whatever it is, right? It becomes too oversimplified, and it's not always focused on the actor and the changes that you want to see those actors doing. So that's where outcome mapping can come in and complement. So you can have an outcome in an RBM framework that talks about women accessing financial resources to set up their small and medium enterprises. But who is involved in making sure that access happens? So what outcome mapping can do is help unpack that and look at, okay, what is it that women need to be doing differently in order for that to happen? What do maybe their husbands need to be doing differently? So, you know, if this is a women's empowerment project in East Africa, then tackling certain behavior changes with husbands is really important so that women can have that access. Like, that access isn't going to happen unless there are certain relational changes. So outcome mapping helps us unpack all of that and ask, what are those changes that need to happen with women, with the husbands? In some communities in Africa, for example, it's with religious leaders. That's another partner that needs to be accounted for in women having access to financial resources, and the financial institutions themselves. I mean, you might have another outcome that talks about the financial institutions in your RBM framework, and again, outcome mapping can help open that up in detail. Okay, what is it that they need to be doing differently? Because it's not just because you do a workshop on women's access to financial resources that everyone's suddenly going to be, all right, here's the access. But it is a journey for that access to happen. So what is that journey that financial institutions need to take, that women need to take, that their husbands need to take, that potentially other actors need to take so that access can happen? And that's what outcome mapping can really help flesh out within RBM framework. It kind of unpacks it, opens it up, and say what are the milestones that need to happen for access to occur, for financial access to occur. So, and it was interesting in the beginning, outcome mapping, IDRC and then CETA were very kind of heads against each other, and these methodologies and approaches are too different, and one is very technocratic and linear thinking. Well, that's RBM, and outcome mapping is not linear thinking, as we saw from the really messy diagram of, you plan something, which is, that's what our nice RBM framework looks like, but this is what actually happens. So eventually we saw that outcome mapping can really be a complement to this. So we have this, we know where we want to go, but outcome mapping can help us really understand how this situation is happening.
Thank you, Kaia. Just a quick follow-up.
Yep.
Because you mentioned the guide that is out now. I myself went through and read it.
Okay.
Yeah, and I see to some extent that there is some sort of a convergence, some sort of a acknowledgement that it's not a linear process. And most of us who practice M&E recognize that it's not a linear process and all. So I'm hearing from the RBM community now about preconditions and, some other words. I mean, they used to have assumptions and, this different sort of thing. But would you agree that there is a convergence and with these different methodologies and to the extent that we can say this, one is preferred over the next. You have to, as practitioner, you still are going to have to contextualize and to ensure that, in your design, you take into consideration some of the usual things that we would do in project management. We have to make the assumptions. We have to do so many different things. So it is indeed a messy process, and it can take so many different routes to get to the ultimate outcome, as we might say, in RBM. We might not make that.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree, and I think what RBM doesn't have are the kind of some concrete concepts and tools to be able to do that, and that's where outcome mapping can come in and say, hey, I've got a few things that can help you conceptualize what the unexpected has been, for example.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. So I think they are very much complementary, and there's a few articles now on the outcome mapping learning community that talks about the complementarity and a few examples as well. Janet has a question.
I want to, okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Following on a word Curly just used, assumption, and also on something you mentioned in terms of working from the organization's point of view, the organization implementing a project. Would outcome mapping be useful at project design stage?
Yes, absolutely. I think because outcome mapping places such an emphasis on stakeholders and then who the stakeholders are that you can actually influence, even if you have to design it using a logic model process and RBM process, especially the concepts of boundary partners, which are a subset of stakeholders, and outcomes and progress markers can help you define what it is you want those kind of broader outcome categories be. It helps you think about who are the actual humans, even, you know, if they're represented by organizations or association, if they're represented by some organization, who are the ones that we, you know, that we're trying to contribute to affect with our intervention. So outcome mapping can help you generate a brainstorm of who those are. And then at the same time, because outcome mapping really asks us to look at relationships between different actors as well, that can give us some clues to assumptions and risks. Kind of, you know, the typical assumptions and risks that we need to define at a design stage, and that, in my experience, they tend to be very general, kind of very high level assumptions and risks related to environmental, political, social conditions. But I think outcome mapping helps us get a little bit more specific about what those assumptions and risks could be, and how to monitor those assumptions and risks too. So yes, absolutely at the design stage, and even if you're starting out with a project that you don't necessarily have a clear vision for, just the visioning exercise with outcome mapping can help, you know, establish your ultimate outcome or your impact level kind of change in a logic model or an RBM. That exercise, that brainstorming and potentially participatory exercise can help kind of flesh out those ideas. Yeah. Matt?
That's me.
Okay.
Good afternoon. This is Paulette Griffiths.
Hi, Paulette.
Right. Thank you very much for this session. It's very interesting, very informative. I'm sitting here thinking that outcome mapping has a lot to do with looking at processes. I think normal monitoring and evaluation tends to be a little bit linear and tend to sometimes forget the process and the impact the process has on the outcome. Is this would you say that is more so than other types of evaluation? Because the process in terms of how the monitoring is carried on, the behavior of those that are involved, and the interrelationships has to do with more to do with human behavior impacting on the outcome of the project, which in normal circumstances we don't tend to spend a lot of time on.
Yes, I agree. I think you've said it very well, Paulette. And you know, as this slide indicates, but as well as this one, that then a miracle occurs. If we can take a peek, if we can take a look at the process part of it, we can understand how the change is happening. Because if we get to an outcome and we see that, yeah, X percentage of women now have access to financial resources for their small businesses, but we don't understand how that happened and who was involved in making that happen, then we lose out on some learning. That's outcome mapping's argument, that if we're not paying attention to the process, then we lose out on some learning to be able to replicate or to, you know, improve for the, you know, round 2 of funding or whatever it might be. I turned off my comments. Anyone else have a comment? Where did they go?
Yeah, I have a comment. Again, Kaia, Valerie here.
Okay.
You know, based on the presentations we had yesterday, I really think, you know, outcome mapping draws a stark contrast, notwithstanding the valid points Caroline made, but a stark contrast to RBM, because in the Vision 2030 presentation, for those of you who were there, you would have seen them grappling with all these complexities, right? You know, dozens of indicators, different sectors, you know, and they are focused on that data that comes out at the end. So the presenter made the point that, you know, the people just really want to meet their target. They're not sure why they meet it. They're not sure why they don't meet it. And she says a lot of the data, you know, the results go up and down from year to year. and they don't know why. They're just saying, well, I hope mine stays up this year. So it gives very little opportunity. This is a problem, obviously, they are grappling with. And it's really because it's results focused and not actor focused, because I think that is a big difference between outcome mapping, that, you know, you do that stakeholder mapping and all of that is very important, and it's tracked. Another presentation that Arlene Bailey made spoke about, you know, focusing on the stakeholders. And it was commented by others that in a lot of cases, you do that stakeholder mapping at the beginning, and then you never look at it again.
Yeah.
So, right. So outcome mapping is really focused on the actors and their behavioral change throughout the processes, and understanding why the result is the way it is, rather than just saying, yeah, we got a good result.
Exactly. And it forces you to look at that stakeholder mapping or analysis throughout the project. It's part of your monitoring.
If I could just add something here, Val. I think it also lies in a big lack of understanding of the evaluation process, because I think to even do RBM properly, you have to have a good understanding of outcome mapping, whether we called it that before or not.
Exactly.
But I think that a lot of good evaluators do practice outcome mapping. We probably never called it that, but like my favorite two words, so what? Outcome mapping helps us to ask. And where I even got to design stage if we really want to influence. And also something else I found in project design, for somebody to be able to monitor properly to see what is happening and with whom, we need to be also very conscious of who the players are, what we require from the players. And that's why when Kaia said, use that example, for example, of people in Africa. It reminded me of a project I was, well, it wasn't an evaluation, but it was an assessment of what was bringing, it was a crime project, what was bringing some success. And you found situations where people decided, we're going to train the young people in the community. And then you found out that the training institution that was being targeted did not have a special training thing. Young people applying from those affected communities were going against the same numbers of people who applied annually that they didn't have adequate space for in the first place.
Wow.
So those affected persons who probably wouldn't have adequate qualifications or anything like that would not have gotten any entry, and they ended up even worse because they were mad. They thought, well, this is a friend thing, nothing to do with us, when it was just not a well thought out plan to effect change. And people also don't think that the particular behavior that you want to change has to be identified, then you plan for that change. So I think it is a lack of understanding, and people who don't understand the nuances of evaluation being involved in planning for evaluations in the first place. And that example you just used is a perfect one.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's a great point, that I think good evaluators are doing this anyways. And, but for, you know, so it will be all very familiar, but for people, I think that, you know, that complexity thinking and systems thinking is new for, you know, what we've heard is that it's nice to have a name now that represents an approach and the core principles, and some tools as well.
Any other questions, comments, inputs? Okay. Well, it's just for me to say on behalf of everyone, thank you very much, Kaia.
Thank you.
Informative, yes, very informative session. And I'm sure others of us will, take a closer look to see which of these tools, how many, we can actually drop into our tool bag if we don't already have it. So thanks again. And it's good to know you're here in the region for a while longer. We can ask you questions. So, yes, so there's a wealth of information. There is a good discussion group on outcome mapping, and questions and comments and things can be posted there. So, please
and if anybody is interested in further exploring it, then, I think Valerie CEI could have a role to play in kind of facilitating some discussion. This region is actually the only region that I don't know of an outcome mapping case. So is that an opportunity for the region to see if outcome mapping is something that can work here? So just kind of pose that to the group, to explore.
Yes, I'll pose that to Vision 2030.
Okay.
See if we can experiment with some of their, it seemed to be a quandary, really. This focus on the data and not knowing what's causing what.
Yeah.
So,
Well, take a look, Valerie. You'll send this PowerPoint PDF to everyone, right?
Yes, okay. I will.
Yeah, and then the outcome mapping learning community has a lot more information. So thank you, everybody.
Good. Thank you, Kaia.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Well done, Valerie.
Yes.
That was very interesting.
Hi, Val.
This is Paulette.
Paulette, yes.
Hi, Paulette. Hi, Val.
I wasn't present I wasn't present last night, but I was present. I listened to all on Zoom. So thank you for that as well.
Yes. I'm happy we caught it. I tell you, God is good, because all week the internet was down at UWI. Can you believe that?
Wow.
From last week.
Yes.
And so on Thursday morning, I am saying to these guys, poor Jan, I badgered him. I said, Jan, create a backup, make sure you have your hotspot, whatever, because I don't know. Even when we got there after, minutes to 4, the guy was saying, I said, oh, the internet's working. He said, don't talk too loud, because it's, he's not sure, because all week it has been giving trouble. So we're so glad that it held.
Yes.
And people. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'm sure. I'm not too sure how many other persons were online, but the line was strong, and we were able to see it all. So I was very happy with that. I just couldn't make it, but I really wanted to hear the presentations. So
yes,
and it has opened up a door for us as JAVOP, because so many of the members keep saying that we need to have a Zoom session. And this is the first time I'm actually zooming into one of the well, not the first time, because we have been doing it via meetings, but it was really a good way to get things, to get the information out there and still attend.
Definitely. And let me tell you, there were about 50 people there.
Okay, so you had a good turnout.
We had a very good turnout, because initially I was saying, put out about 30 chairs. They said, they would put out about 30 chairs. And then a few hours before it started, they said, we have 45 people registered. So they quickly went up and put out all the chairs. And I think there were maybe 1 or 2 empty. So we were very pleased, and really, I'm sure you heard the discussion after that. People really wanted more of that kind of discussion. Exchange.
I heard you plug in JAVOP and see.
Yes, definitely.
Right. So hopefully we have some contact details to get those persons to the meeting at the end of the month.
Yes, I am eagerly awaiting the list, but I tell you, sometimes this is a bottleneck. They had pages and pages of people signing in. So I hope they're not going to take 2 weeks to type it up before they give it to me. I think I'm going to ask for the, if they can scan and send it, because usually that is a bottleneck. They don't realize how important that is to us.
Right.
Even after this session, somebody from the Mexican embassy was there. He has apparently been supporting the government, and I think Salises also. So he took my card and told me he'll be in touch. And there was some real good feedback. As you would have seen, I sent some information to the board. So I think there is room for us to there's a responsibility for us to continue the dialogue. And for those who didn't know it, Marcia Brandon in Barbados, she made a presentation to a group. She said she didn't think she was going to be able to join because she had this board meeting. And she said she made a presentation to the group and 10 people want to join.
Wow.
Right? So,
Oh, that's fantastic. But we met with her when she was here.
I know. Yes. And so, remember my charge to the different countries this week is go and meet with at least, a group, a person, something to just tell them about the CEI, because there is a thirst and there is a need out there, and people will grab onto it because nobody, too few know that we exist. And people want the information. So she said that one group, so she said we should be in Nike mode, Nike, just do it. And that's what we need to do. So I'm really thankful for gLOCAL, because despite the fact that, of course, we didn't get any resources, it turns out that just making the effort to have these things happen, you can see the multiplier effect already, know.
Fantastic.
So,
is Curleen online? Or she left?
Excuse me?
I just wonder, No, Curleen. I was just wondering if Curleen is online.
Yes, she is. I see her online.
Curleen?
Oops, I should stop the recording.
Okay. I was just, two things, Valerie. When I was writing up the